We've just been talking about the basic education, Lekgotla, and I want to stay on the theme. While education continues to be a priority, the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni announcing that government will, in the next 3 years, trim expenditure in the learning and culture function. Over the medium term, the learning and culture function accounts for 1.23 trillion rand. That's around 23.5% of consolidated expenditure. So here's the big question. How is this going to impact on learning going forward, often in classrooms that are underfunded anyway? I want to talk from the union Naptosa to its Executive Director, Basil Manuel. Good afternoon to you, Basil. I know you've just stepped out of this meeting, and thank you very much indeed. First of all, this expenditure trim that's been announced or amplified on by the Finance Minister, what's your understanding of it?
Jeremy, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. In the medium-term budget expenditure framework, we heard that there will be a reduction of about 14 billion, and of course over a 3-year period. Now, when you think about the deficits in education and the shortfalls, you think about the mud schools and the infrastructure issues, etc., it has a huge impact. Add to that the additional mention yesterday afternoon about less money for teacher posts. And then you start seeing that we are looking at larger class sizes in a situation where we already have a pandemic, and our class sizes are so large that we have to have these attendance at school that is a day at a time for every different class, rotationally, and that sort of doesn't sit well with us, particularly if you think that some schools are already overpopulated. So there are some real concerns that we have with those two statements that have been made.
How do you cut your cloth as a sector accordingly, or are you going to tell me you've simply run out of material to cut?
Jeremy, when I reflect on just class sizes, your average class size is about 40. Now, if you reduce class sizes, if you increase class sizes anymore, where are you going to? And there's a golden sort of line that you shouldn't step over, where teaching changes from interacting with learners to becoming child minding, where you are simply just looking after a large group of people. And we've got to be careful if we want quality, and we want quality to grow. Now, remember that we have made many gains. There are many things that still have to improve, but many gains have been made, and those gains will be lost. So I can't see how we are going to trim this. And when it comes to infrastructure, we're lagging behind already, given that a lot of the money was used for COVID PPEs, etc. So the last year, 2019, saw very little infrastructure development. And that brings us to a critical point where if we don't do more with infrastructure, in 10 years' time, we'll still be sitting with the mud and the schools that are hardly habitable.
Part of the challenge, the Minister says, Basil Manuel, is not about infrastructure. This is what he says, and I quote, "You, the education sector, have to develop ways of using information and communication technology more effectively to enhance blended learning." I mean, that's the future, isn't it?
It is the future, but let's look at the lessons learned from 2019 into 2020. One of the things that the few schools that had online learning demonstrated to us so aptly is how well this can work. Did we learn any lessons from it? How many of our schools that didn't have are now suddenly going to get? Now, I'm not talking about putting a tablet in every child's hand or data. That's not affordable in the short term. But are we taking this to the church halls, to the mosques, to the temples, where those grade 11s that are not in school every day can at least do the core subjects? And you know what, Jeremy? We don't even have to find teachers to teach. We can knock on the door of the schools doing it to say, please broadcast to here as well. And I guarantee you they will. But we haven't learned that. So this is lip service to something that is indeed an important thing. But unless we give it life, then we are just making a noise.
And you're attending this Lekgotla right now. You've just stepped out, as I mentioned. When you raise these concerns, as no doubt you have, with the Minister and her officials, what do they tell you?
Well, this has not been an issue that has been raised yet. However, we have had some discussions already, pre-discussions on the current performances, etc. And we are going to raise this at the appropriate time, either later this afternoon or tomorrow, where we are going to certainly highlight that the lessons that have been so hard to learn, we haven't taken to heart, and we want to see. Don't tell us about coding and robotics. Those are words that are used very commonly these days in educational discourse. Show us how we can start at the ground and make it work today. I'm not saying coding and robotics is not important, but it must be helping our children now and today with the deficits right now.
The Minister's going to come back to you at some point, and she's going to say that there's no more money available for any of this. Mr. Manuel and your union, put your cap back on. We can't help you. Make do with what you've got. Are you prepared to do that?
Jeremy, we've been doing that all along, and it's been a tough road. And many of our teachers, unbeknown to millions, have to dip their hands into their pockets sometimes to see that education continues. And that is why we are not being unrealistic in terms of on learning. We are not suggesting the big picture that can only be achieved in about 10, 15 years' time. We are saying there are small ways where we can change. But when it comes to health and safety, the provision of toilets, water, etc., there can be no compromise. After all this time that we've been busy, surely we can manage to do some of those things and do them right.
I want to slip one more in as we approach the half-hour headlines. Does less money, the trimming, as the finance minister puts it, eventually mean poorer matric results? Can you draw a line between those two?
I don't know if there's a direct correlation, because we've seen some of our poorest schools performing magnificently and some of the schools that have much more not performing so well. Although there is a causal link that can be made in certain instances when provision of teachers comes into play, when doing the extra things like just buying materials for your laboratory because they're not being supplied, and the learners only know the theory of what is happening in the lab and not the reality, then yes, a causal link can be made. But it's not automatic, in my opinion.
Basil Manuel, I'll let you get back to the Lekgotla, the National Professional Teachers Organisation of South Africa, Naptosa. That's the Executive Director, Basil Manuel.